We're back in Biology of Fishes, today being the 4th, I think, of October. A scant week away now from the exam, and I got to keep reminding the folks who are, particularly the ones who are off campus who are enrolled in the course, that you need to have a proctor lined up. No proctor, no exam is the way it works. So I need to hear from you if I haven't. My local students come in two subsets. There's the group that's officially meeting with me, and I'll expect that group to be here in the room at 11:10 next Thursday to start the exam. The group who is web-based, who can't meet with me for whatever reason, you need to be talking to me about scheduling. My plan is to schedule you right after this exam. Probably not in this room. I think I'll schedule you up in room 213, which is the conference room upstairs. And I'll arrange for a proctor, myself or someone else. I think it'll be either Donovan or maybe somebody else. I can't remember whether Donovan said he couldn't do it after or he could. He said he couldn't, so it'll probably be Felix Arnold who proctors the group. And anybody in their local group that's got a problem and would prefer to wait until 12:30 is welcome to do so too, although I'd like not to get too many. I'd like for it not to be too imbalanced. Now, Ray, when are you going to do it? No, Ray's probably not going to want to do it.
10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago, Ray said. I think it was more like 15 or 17, wasn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so anyhow, I'm just teasing now. We were talking about burst swimming. I was doing this aside, and I was saying that burst swimming in fishes, as in other critters, relies on what we call white muscle. And I was telling stories at the end of the session last time about burst swimming tuna, and I didn't point out, I don't think, that these are speed demons. They're designed for it. I mean, they got things like fins that fold down into little slots, so they don't create as much drag as they would otherwise. I mean, they really have they got these strongly falcate tail fins, that are the best, as every aeronautical engineer knows, for maximizing thrust with minimal drag at high speed. So, I mean, they're really made for speed, and they can achieve body lengths per second on the order of 25 body lengths for fish that are half meter long. Most fish can't do it anything like at that size. These 10 to 20 body length per second values here would only apply in really small fish for other non-tunas. So the burst swimming is powered by mostly anaerobic metabolism that's going on in the white muscle. Aerobic metabolism occurs in the red muscle. Red muscle's red because it's got a lot of myoglobin, which is the storage form for immediately available oxygen to support a lot of aerobic work. White muscle's white or light because it doesn't have a lot of myoglobin, and instead runs anaerobically in the short term. Aerobic metabolism powers continuous swimming and yields 456 kilocalories or 38 moles of ATP per mole of glycogen converted to CO2. Anaerobic metabolism, which powers the burst swimming, yields only about less than 10% as much energy per unit, 36 kilocalories per mole. And the metabolism of that anaerobic metabolism results in lactate accumulation in the muscle, and then the lactate has to be metabolized or reconverted one way or the other to get everything back in balance, to pay off the oxygen debt which accumulates. In the case of tunas and in many other fishes, the white muscle and the red muscle fibers are segregated in different masses. And when you fillet a white bass or a yellow bass, you can see the dark muscle, that's the red muscle, and then the white muscle is white. In the case of other fishes, the red and white fibers are mixed together. And sometimes there's a gradual gradation of metabolism from fully aerobic to mostly anaerobic, with some aerobic activity going on. A lot of variability. Okay, another component then, I guess after respiration. And respiration, remember, has three subcomponents. The standard component that powers the basal activities, the processing of nutrients, food processing that we call A sub D, and then the one I just talked about, A sub A, which is the activity component. The next component is the waste component, and that consists of two subcomponents, the fecal and the urinary or nitrogenous waste. Talk about A sub F first. That's the rate of energy loss in the feces. It's not the energy cost of producing feces. It's not the energy cost of doing anything inside the fish. It's the actual value of materials, energy value of materials left in the feces once they leave the fish. And it may include some things that are not immediately, or didn't have their immediate sources as food waste. It may be sloughed off materials from the lining of the gut, for example. We estimate fecal loss rates by monitoring the passage of an indigestible marker, sometimes using a natural substance like the ash content of the food, sometimes an artificial component like chromic oxide. And the computation is treated as variously complex, I guess, but I don't think it really is in the simplest form. In the simplest form, the rate of fecal loss is simply the ratio of the proportion that the marker makes up of the feed divided by the proportion that it makes up of the feces, multiplied times the consumption, the rate of food consumption. So, you don't have to even remember which is the numerator and which is the denominator. If you just take it to the limit, as in so many problems, you can take it to a natural limit and see how it logically has to work. If you think about the rate of marker in the feed being 1%, which is typical for using something like chromic oxide, then if the feed is 1% and the marker in the feces is 100%, then that means every bit of the nutrient that was in the food, everything that was useful, has been taken in by the fish, and the only thing that's left in the feces is the marker. And so it wouldn't surprise you then that the rate of fecal loss is almost zero of the nutrient or the energy or whatever it is that you're marking. On the other hand, if the fish is producing feces with the same proportion of marker in it that the feed had, that's not a good thing, right? That means that it's just putting it straight through. It's not getting anything out of the food. It's giving you a mix that is exactly like the feed. So in that case, AF would be 100% of AC. Not good. So we measure the quality of feeds partly by measuring this ratio. And the smaller that ratio, the better, because that means more of the energy or more of the nutrient in whatever case. I'm thinking in terms of energy here, but you could be thinking in terms of nitrogen or any specific nutrient. The smaller that R over F is, the better the feed. AF is typically about 10 to 20% in the case of natural feeds. 15% is the number that a lot of people use as sort of a nominal value in modeling work. But it can approach half for very poor feeds, and I've seen some of those. It's like maybe there's a lot of energy value there, but it's all indigestible. It's hairballs or something that they use to generate the protein. Bed sweepings, I like to think, is the source of the nutrient. But if it's high quality, if it's the Gatlin feeds, if it's the Gatlin super diet, then that A sub F is going to be less than 1/10, maybe only, or somewhere between 1/10 and maybe 15%. Digestibility then is actually measured or expressed as the difference between consumed energy or consumed nutrient and fecal losses of that energy or nutrient divided by the rate of consumed energy. And physiologists, for the most part, would probably use the word assimilability as opposed to digestibility. I don't know whether the word is just because digestibility sort of rolls off the tongue more easily or what, but there's some fine differences between, and has to do with things like the fact that some of the fecal matter is actually excreted stuff rather than waste that, didn't get material that was not assimilated. AC minus AF over AC. So A sub U, the other component of waste, energy loss as waste, is the nitrogenous stuff that the fish is producing, and the U is sort of an artifact and a holdover of the fact that in humans and mammals, U is mostly urinary waste, so U, I guess, stands for urine. But in fish, as you already know, most of the nitrogenous waste leaves in forms other than urine. We estimate it by monitoring nitrogen accumulation in the medium. It's the easiest way, and it's not always successful. It's hard to keep the system clean. You don't want to get deamination, or you don't want to get nitrification going on, and that'll happen if you're basically having to use a sterile system. 60 to 70% of the nitrogenous wastes of fish are typically ammonia excreted at the gills, despite the reference to urinary. And the equivalency relationship is that ammonia is worth about 5 kilocalories per gram. A rule of thumb is usually used because it's not something that people are regularly doing, trying to estimate directly. So normally what you do is assume a result that's one that was generated by Brett or somebody. And that is that the rate of urinary waste production or nitrogenous waste production of fish is somewhere between 5 and 8% of the ration. So when you add A sub U and A sub F together, typically the sum is about 0.25. I guess that's saying that A sub F is maybe 0.15 and A sub U is 0.05. There's a little bit of a problem with that, as you have learned in the application part of Lab 2. And it has to do with the fact that fish that are starving are still producing nitrogenous waste because they're combusting their own tissues. So you have to actually put in a minimum calculation and say A sub U is the minimum of 5 to 8% of A sub C, or it's a certain fraction of A sub R, whichever is greater. And the certain fraction of A sub R will be greater in the case of a starving fish because A sub C is 0. But for fish fed anything at all, really, typically the fraction 5 to 8% of A sub C will be greater than some reasonable fraction of A sub R. A sub G is finally the bottom line. That's what we're headed towards. That's what we've been wanting to get to all along here. And that's the rate of gain or loss of energy that balances the energy budget. A sub G is obviously all somatic in the case of juvenile fish. But as fish approach reproductive maturity, more and more of A sub G gets channeled into reproductive tissue, gonadal tissue. And there's some fancy endocrine physiology and directive responses to changed environment that gets figured into that. Day length particularly, and temperature changes. Most of you probably are aware that Texas Parks and Wildlife Department uses temperature and day length manipulation to bring red drum into spawning condition and to trigger spawning. AG has the lowest priority of any term on the right side of the budget. Everything else has to be balanced out before you're going to get any AG, and it's the only one that can go less than 0, which it would have to do, obviously, in the case of a fish that's being starved, which has no A sub C, but has finite positive values of these other expenditure terms. And for that reason, I like to say that growth is a bioenergetic residual. And that's the way growth modelers calculate it typically, is as a residual. In other words, solve the energy budget, and whatever you get as a difference is growth, and that can be translated then as how much growth you're going to get, or how much loss in weight you're going to get. What kind of range would you expect? Well, under optimum conditions in aquaculture, if you're really doing well and got a very successful operation, juvenile fish under optimum environmental conditions, maybe up to half of A sub C, 50% feed conversion, in other words. But in the wild, where conditions aren't so good, increasing AC comes usually only at the expense of increasing activity, because you got to chase your food down. You're dealing with bigger fish, not necessarily little fish. Then in those conditions, under those conditions, AG can be is more normally somewhere below 20% of AC, somewhere between 5 and 20, I would say. These numbers are not just out of the air, but they're out of the literature over a whole bunch of years for a whole bunch of fish of different species under different conditions. So you need to keep in mind that these are ranges and that they're nominal values, and any particular case could yield something really different. And it wouldn't be wrong, it would just be different. Efficiency measures for growth. Aquaculturists like to talk feed conversion ratio. Other folks who are more pure physiologists like to talk about growth efficiency. And the two are sort of inverses of each other, but not directly. I'm going to point out the not real subtle difference, but it's a difference that a lot of people don't seem to pick up on so quickly. Gross growth efficiency, usually represented in the physiology literature by E sub T, I guess T standing for total, not time. E sub T is expressed as the rate instantaneously of growing divided by the instantaneous rate of feeding. And probably you should put quotes around the instantaneous part, because those are integrated actually over short periods of time. They're not really instantaneous, maybe over one day. So the rate of growing versus the rate of feeding. And you're obligated, of course, to keep these in the same dimensional context, or it won't be an equality. So if you're going to measure growth rate as energy per unit time, which would probably be best, then you need to measure consumption in the same dimensions. Can't talk about growth as grams per day or grams per gram per day, even in energy and calories per gram per day. That's not going to work for you. Partial or net growth efficiency is sort of after you've taken into account maintenance. What kind of maintenance requirement is there? Then it's the gain, it's the efficiency of growth above that point. So the rate of growing divided by the difference between consumed energy and the maintenance rate of energy consumption, just to hold energy constant. And then that brings us to the other measure, which is feed conversion. And there's some important differences here, and I'd like you all to have a good grip on these, particularly if you're aquaculturists. It's sort of, kind of won over feed efficiency, except for the fact that typically we're talking about integration over a much longer period of time, and often it's all the way from stocking the pond to harvest, because you don't know. All you know is how many pounds of feed went into the pond and how many pounds of fish were produced. And that's the way you measure feed conversion efficiency in a commercial operation. It's technically the sum of the weight of feed, usually as fed, over the whole interval of integration, whatever that is, like the whole harvest cycle, divided by the sum of the weight of fish at harvest, less the sum of the weights of the individual fish at stocking. And since the weights at stocking are frequently near zero, people tend to throw that term out often and not worry about the biomass of fish that was stocked. It's much of a fry. But if you're stocking, fingerling fish, then you probably would want to take that into account. So when I say sum, I mean the sum of the individual fish weights at harvest versus, or the total, the aggregate weight, less the aggregate weight of the fish at stocking. So, what are maybe I've got someplace else here I've gone into this, but I don't want to run the risk of forgetting to mention some of the issues, some of the concerns. And they are these. The first of all being this whole idea of the time of integration. The growth efficiencies are usually taken as quote instantaneous rates. They have to be, to be legitimate, they have to be in the same dimensions of energy and time. Over short periods of time, you wouldn't have dead fish, hopefully. So they take no consideration of mortality or the probability of mortality. Whereas it's clear that if you're talking about FCRs measured over the course of a production cycle, you're obviously talking about the integral of growth and mortality or survival. So, it's the total pounds of fish you take out of the pond, and some of that, would be greater if you didn't lose a lot of fish the last week before you harvested. And often that's the time when you lose them, unfortunately. The risky times in fish production are right after you stock, because there you run the risks of putting fish into an alien situation. It may not be optimum, and you've got some handling damage of all these tender little juveniles. They're having to change the kind of feed they're eating, maybe. They're not aware, or they're not familiar with the risk of predation. So all those things make for high mortality at the point right after stocking. Then the survivors, sort of get into kind of in the groove, so to speak, and they do okay for a while. But as the survivors grow and biomass increases per unit system, per unit resources, I almost said per acre, but that's not the total story, right? It's per unit resources that biomass is increasing in terms of. Then the risk of mortality goes up again, particularly when you get to the point where you're right ready to harvest and you got maximum biomass and you get all of a sudden a cloudy day, or the aerators, the paddle wheels don't turn on, you get a power failure, you get something that is every fish husbandry person's nightmare, and you lose your crop. So what's your FCR in that case? Some of the weight of fish at harvest, 0. It could be negative, right? be negative, but a very large number, a small number down here in the denominator that's negative divided into a very large sum that you had to feed these fish. That wouldn't be good. So you don't want that kind of... If you're going to lose your fish, lose them the day you stocked them, not the day you harvest them. So, if you take into account mortality, then that, puts a whole new twist on the whole picture. Then the final consideration is that, when you're talking FCRs, you're usually using as fed weights and as harvested live weights of fish. And so you're dividing a wet weight into a dry weight often. The feed that's fed in commercial operations is typically about 90% dry matter as it comes out of the feed bin or out of the bag, and the fish that are harvested are only 20% maybe dry matter. And so that can lead to some really strange sounding results. Now, what are normal FCRs? Well, 2 or 3 or 4. An FCR of 2 is kind of a nominal target, I guess, in commercial production. You'd like to feed no more than 2 pounds of feed for every pound of fish produced. That'd be good. More likely it's going to be 4 or 3. But it can be less than 1, and it is often in chicken production. How would that be? How do you suppose that you can have an FCR that's below 1? Well, if you're getting real high gross growth efficiency, optimal feed, optimum conditions, no mortality, you could produce a pound of chicken, on a pound of feed. And in fact, you'd like to do that. In fact, you could even produce 1.25 pounds of chicken on a pound of feed. Because you're producing 1.25 pounds of wet chicken on a pound of dry feed. And when you take the wet to dry, all of a sudden that kind of makes your ratio different. Another way you can get to below 1 on feed conversion, and this would even happen in low-intensity aquaculture, is the sum W feed there only represents what came out of the hopper or out of the Purina bag or out of the truck. It doesn't represent all of that, what we call allocthinous production. I'm not even sure I could spell that, Zoe. ALLOCTHONOUS as opposed to autochthonous production. Autochthonous production is production in place, like photosynthetic production going on in your pond, and then allocthinous is all the grasshoppers and stuff that drops in from the outside world. And in the case of low-intensity aquaculture, a lot of your production may come from outside energy, nutrient sources. And so you could, in theory, not feed anything and get production, and that's often done in shrimp. In low-intensity shrimp production in the subtropics, people are growing shrimp without feeding them. Maybe they're putting some fertilizer in the water. Ray has a point to be made.
I have a question. Growth on the top, gross growth efficiency, that's on a calorie per calorie basis?
It needs to be on the same dimensional basis in the numerator and the denominator, however you want to measure it. Energy,
okay.
Ideally, yeah.
And so then the bottom one is the mass per mass?
Typically, it's mass per mass, and it's dry mass of feed or as-fed feed versus live weight or as-harvested fish, typically. And numbers, and I think I may have a slide somewhere later on that covers this, and I'm probably jumping the gun on it, and I'm probably forgetting to say something I should. But 2 reasons why FCRs can be below 1 are, number 1, you're just getting real good, efficient growth and no mortality, and you're feeding dry feed and you're harvesting wet fish or chickens. And number 2, some of that source of input is coming from outside your system. You're not measuring it as feed, whether it's, grasshoppers falling in or something else. Those are the 2 things. So this is a summary. that I put together based on, I think, probably something done similar that was produced by Raleigh Brett years ago. But it attempts to bring all these rules of thumb together and sort of give you a flow of ideas and relationships. And it starts at the top with A sub C. You can imagine one A sub C. I just didn't bother putting in the 1, because what we're going to do is take one unit of A sub C and then partition it and prioritize it. And the first partition is between what a lot of folks call assimilated energy and everything else, which is fecal energy. That's the retained energy by the animal. And if, as I told you, the usual rules hold, A sub F is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 of A sub C, so that means that assimilated energy is the complement. It's somewhere between 0.8 and 0.9 of A sub C. And then of the energy that's assimilated, let's take off another 5% sort of as overhead, as nitrogenous waste. That's not really overhead, additional waste. And the reason for partitioning that and putting it down here after assimilated energy is that energy has to actually enter the animal in a literal sense. It has to move. A lot of people would make the case that if it doesn't ever get out of the gut, it never was inside the animal. Because that's continuous with the outside world, right? In a way, tube within a tube type deal. Whereas if it gets into the animal and it's in the form of amino acids, and the amino acids get deaminated to give you nitrogen, in amines, then it was truly inside. So that's the reason that most people would break out A sub U as separate from A sub F. In practice, I don't know that it matters. For most modeling work, it doesn't. Well, I guess it does, because we say that, you may not have to give any A sub F. If you don't eat, you don't produce any fecal waste. That's not really true. So you can go ahead and say that A sub F is, in fact, a certain percentage of A sub C. And if A sub C is 0, then A sub F is 0. But you can't say that A sub U is 0 if A sub C is 0. It's a fraction of something else. So maybe that gives reason to make this breakdown. Whatever you got left then is metabolizable energy. So take another 5% off 0.8, 0.9, you get 0.75, 0.85. And then that metabolizable energy is partitioned into net energy, which is, some people would say, useful energy, and something that's not so useful, namely the energy work of deaminating protein. And so that 10% we might take straight off metabolizable because it's not useful. That's the work of deaminating proteins. That's true SDA. And then the other 5% is what's left over. It has to do with things like transformations of substrates and storage costs and that kind of thing. So the sum of those two, though, is another 15%. Leaving, after everything is removed here, I guess, well, let's see, 0.6, 0.7. It looks like I have taken away, I'm thinking 0.6. If it was 0.75, it's 0.6. If it's 0.85, it's 0.7. So it looks like I've already deducted this, both the 0.1 and the 0.05 to get the net energy here at 0.6. That could be considered an error in the way I've done my calculations, I guess. I'm not real sure that it makes a whole lot of difference. But so then, 5% of AC, the useful part of A sub D, and then the rest of this is kind of by difference. And what I'm claiming here is that A sub S could range from maybe as little as 10% of A sub C. That would be in the optimum conditions, right? That would be best case scenario. In other words, you've got such good, a lot of A sub C and everything is perfect, and you're using only 10% of that to support standard metabolism. Now, if things aren't so good, you have to use more and more. A sub C is lesser. A sub S then increases as a proportion. And finally, you're using everything that was left over, 7/10 of A sub C, to support standard metabolism. Okay, now things are really bad, or you're not getting anything to eat, and you're having to dip into reserves, and so you go into biomass that you've already accumulated, and you're losing energy at the rate of 1 to 2% per day, maybe. That would be a terrible situation where, environmental conditions are such that you're really having to engage in a lot of standard metabolism. You're not getting any food. I'm not sure you'd ever get to quite that extreme or dire straits, but possible, I guess. And then down here is A sub A, and I guess the argument is here that you wouldn't really engage in any activity if you didn't have anything to gain from it, so you wouldn't have any if you were in that situation where you burn everything up just to do in standard metabolism. But under good conditions, you might just be out charging around, migrating, using a lot of energy to support A sub A, and you're getting a lot of good food, and you're using 6/10 of your AC. You've got 6/10 to use for activity. So you end up with A sub R being from somewhere between 25% and 70% of A sub C, and maybe an additional up to 1 to 2% of body weight a day if A sub C is really small and if these demands are really large. I guess if I'm giving you the impression that there's a world of room of slop around here in this system, so fish can either grow or not grow, and then I'm probably giving you the truth. So notice that the order that I've got things listed from top to bottom sort of reflects this kind of priority. You're not going to do anything if you don't consume some food, and then once you consume it, the first thing you're going to have to do is eliminate waste. And then only after you've eliminated waste would you have to worry about meeting the requirements of standard metabolism with that food. And then only after you've met, first you got to do SDA and the costs of processing the food, the overhead, then you meet standard metabolism, and then if you've got anything left after that, you can engage some activity. And then finally, only then would you have anything to put into growth. So the emphasis here is on the fact that growth is a residual. And notice that it's turned around, in growth, under really terrible conditions, can be negative, up to about 2% of body weight per day lost to support all these other demands. And only under positive conditions then would some energy be going into growth. And I've got a maximum here of 0.6, and I think I told you 0.5 would probably be the best if total feed best only about let's see, what do I want to say? That total growth efficiency, or gross growth efficiency, might be a maximum of about 0.5 under best scenario. And I've got 0.6 here, so that's really good. But I think the pattern, the relationships that I'm showing you are reasonably the right ones. Anybody have any questions about the thing about this that some people find a little confusing is this flux from using the energy in the feed into having to use the energy in your own biomass, which is previous feed. That's the only way you got energy, was to have eaten somewhere in your life. If you don't eat any time, then this is an undefined system. You don't have a game to play. There's nothing to eat the consumed energy if there's no animal that ever grew to start with. So you have to have some past in order to play in the present. Certainly the future. Okay, well, a little example. You might see this again. Something like it at least. And I think maybe, I'm not sure, was there an example like this in the lab somewhere maybe? I can't remember. Suppose we got the following information, real world scenario here. Channel catfish being fed good pelleted feed at 28 degrees in a pond. That's pretty much optimum conditions. And I'm telling you right up front that the standard component of metabolism and the activity component together amount to 25 calories of processing per kilocalorie of catfish doing that processing per day. which would be a pretty good number, I think. I'm also telling you that feed digestibility is about nominal, about 0.8. What's the maintenance ration? That's all you need to know in order to calculate a maintenance ration, using these rules of thumb that we've talked about. How would you do this problem? Well, you'd do it just like you did it on the application part of Lab 2, And I guess this makes sure you really were looking to see what Excel was doing for you. I tried to make it easy for you, but I didn't want to make it thoughtless for you. I wanted to make it work low. I didn't want to make it work less, but I certainly didn't want to make it thoughtless. I wanted you to think about what you were doing, what Excel was doing. And what you should be thinking about here is, hey, balanced energy budget. A sub C is equal to what? It's equal to A sub R plus A sub W plus A sub G. Hey, maintenance, what's the key there? Well, the key thought there is, hey, if it's maintenance, that means A sub G is defined as 0. That's the whole idea of maintenance. So that reduces our complexity a little bit. A sub C, now we can write, instead of A sub C, we can write A sub C maint, meaning now we're talking about that specific A sub C rate that's equivalent to maintenance. So I'm sort of writing this equation for you here in the air, and I'm hoping you're hearing my words or seeing my arm waving, but what I'm saying is A sub C maint is equal to 25 calories per kilocalorie per day plus A sub D maint, because that doesn't include A sub D maint, plus 15% of A sub C maint, right? Because that's the waste component by rule of thumb. And technically we would have to back off and say, well, we're going to have to test to see if 15% of A sub C maint is greater than or not greater than a certain percentage of AR. But I can kind of guarantee you that it will be in this case. And, we had to do one other thing too, and that was that we had to start out not with A sub C maint, but 0.8 A sub C. Am I saying that right? Somebody help me here. I'm testing to see if anybody's following anything I'm saying. What I'm thinking is A sub C maint is going to have to be 8/10 of the actual feed fed, and so 8/10 of that amount is going to have to supply the energy necessary to generate 25 calories per kilocalorie per day and 15% of A sub C maint. Y'all are lost, huh? Let's waste the rest of this time here getting out a whiteboard and doing this, I thought we actually did something like this on the lab, did we not? It's essentially the same kind of picture. Hold on a second. We're going to pause this and see if I can get a white screen to work with. We're going to work this one out. I'm not going to work out the one that says how fast do fish lose the weight if feeding stops. Hang on. Okay, we, I think, are recording again. I hope we're recording again because I spent a lot of time laboriously scratching with this mouse to write this message on the screen with the help and for the benefit of the local group. And thanks to the local group, I think we have the correct response to the first part of the question raised in slide 20, which is, what is maintenance ration? And I'm going to go through and explain it for the record again and hope that my local group will monitor what I say and fix anything I say wrong. The very first step here is the digestibility step, and we did it last actually, but it says that feed digestibility is 0.8. We're given that much. And so what does that mean in terms of the balanced energy budget equation? It means that fecal losses are 20%, 0.2 times AC. So the assumption is that if the digestibility of the feed is 80% at one ration level, it'll be 80% at all ration levels. And that's always subject to some doubt. But we're going to assume that at the maintenance ration, we are safe in assuming that A sub F is 20% of A sub C. And that's what this first little squiggle here is supposed to represent. So at that point, then, I can write the balanced energy budget equation for a specific instance of AC, the one that's AC maint. And I claim that that's 25, and remember that's calories per kilocalorie per day, plus an additional component that's attributable to food processing. And I'm going to assume that we're safe in taking the nominal 15% to account for that. Then we've got the waste production rate, and part of that's coming from the 2/10 of AC, that's the fecal waste. Another part's coming from the 5% or so that's nitrogenous waste, giving a total of 0.25. Now, in the application part of Lab 2, you might have noticed, I hope you did notice, that you really have to ask the question at this point, is it possible that the consumption is so low that the fish is going to have to dip into its stored reserves in order to do the necessary work that's going to eliminate nitrogenous waste, as it would have to do in the case of starvation, for example? So we really need to test to see whether A sub U is 5% of A sub C, or 5 to 8%, or is it some percentage of A sub R? In this case, I'm going to be assuming that it's going to be maximally 5% of A sub C rather than A sub R. That we don't have to go into A sub R to do that. So all I'm doing here is adding the 25% A sub W and the 15% A sub D for maintenance. That's what the M is supposed to represent, to give me the 4/10 A sub C maintenance for the two. So now I can write that 6/10 of A sub C maintenance, in other words, I'm subtracting the 4/10 that I had over here on the right from the 1 that I had on the left, that 6/10 of A sub C maintenance is 25. And now dividing both sides of this reduced equation by 0.6, I get A sub C maintenance is 25 divided by 0.6, and I'm told by my colleagues here that that amounts to 41.67 calories of consumed energy per kilocalorie of catfish per day. We still haven't really said what the ration is in the context of mass of feed. That requires that you know what the energy density of the feed as fed is. And if we're feeding our fish pellets, then we have to suppose a value, and a good value might be 4,000 calories, 4,000 calories per gram, or 4 calories per milligram, I guess. So we could go ahead and calculate the required mass of feed in order to deliver this 41.67 calories. Would somebody like to do that calculation for me while I pause this so we can do it off the record? Okay, we're back on the record. My friends and I here in the room, and I want to blame them. They all agree this is right. No, they don't really. They're still looking at this as you are, wondering what in the world is he doing. What I'm trying to do at this point, folks, is convert this maintenance requirement expressed in energy terms into a actual feed, actual fish flesh equivalency. And I did that by making a couple of assumptions. I started out with what we had on the last view. I changed the color because I got tired of trying to read that insipid color, whatever it was, and went to black. And what this now says is A sub C maint is 41.67, and the dimensions are calories of energy processed as ration per kilocalorie of catfish doing that processing per day. And I reached into my bag of rules of thumb and drug out the fact that I'm going to assume that 1 gram of dry pelleted catfish feed as fed has 4,000 little calories in it. And so I figure that, that means that each milligram has 4 little calories in it, right? And so what we did was say, well, how many milligrams of feed do we need to feed to get 41.67 calories? And we got that result by just dividing 4 into 41.67. And we concluded that we need 10.4 milligrams of this feed to supply 41.67 calories of energy. Now, how many grams of catfish are going to be consuming that feed? Well, again, my rule of thumb says that if we're talking nominal biomass of wet fish flesh, we're talking about 1,000 milligrams, or we're talking about 1,000 calories per gram. And that's 1 kilocalorie. So 1 gram yields 1 kilocalorie, 1,000 milligrams, 1,000 calories. And so I wrote here for a kilocalorie, 10,000 milligrams. That's 1 gram. And now I've got milligrams over grams, and then I've got this dimensions out here per day. The squiggle you can't read. This leads us to the conventional percent per day rate. But we've done it in a rigorous, legitimate way. We've kept track of the change in energy density in the numerator and the denominator to get to this point. And so I claim in the final analysis that dividing 1,000 into 10 is like dividing 1.04 by 100, and that's 1.04%. So I claim that the result here is, under these conditions, that the maintenance ration for channel catfish in this pond at 28 degrees is 1.04% per day on a weight of feed fed per weight of fish basis. And my aquaculture colleagues here would confirm that that's a reasonable number. Not necessarily that it's right, but it's at least consistent with what you'd expect if you were feeding catfish. Okay, we're going to finally draw a halt here. We've labored long and hard, painfully, I would say, but I think we finally reached the result. I ask you, though, to consider the other part of this question. How fast does a fish lose weight if it starves? What does that mean? Well, it means A sub C is defined as 0. And so 0 has got to be equal to everything on the right-hand side of the equation, including an AG term. And we know that only AG is going to be there to take up the slack, so to speak, and the only part that can go negative. So we're going to have a negative AG to represent the rate of loss of energy. So if you can just get to that part, I'm pretty happy with you. You ought to be able to get a little closer quantitatively, though, by going ahead and putting these rules of thumb in there. But when we get to the rate of loss problem, we're going to have to accept the fact and deal with it that A sub W is not going to be 0. A sub W is going to have to be a small positive number that represents the rate of loss for nitrogenous waste from the tissue. So we're going to have to put a little something of some fraction of A sub r in there, some fraction of A sub s plus A sub. So you can almost write this equation in your head, right? 0 equals 25, because we're still going to have A sub s and we're still going to have A sub a. We're going to assume that these catfish have to be just as active if they're starving as if they're not. So 0 is equal to 25 plus 15% of AC for A sub d, but wait a minute, got none of that. So we can zero that term. Plus A sub w, well, the A sub f is, we're going to assume 0. We zero that term, so we're left with the part of A sub w that's A sub u, and that's not going to be 5% of A sub c anymore, because A sub c is 0. So it's going to be 5% of maybe A sub r. That's what I would use. And then plus A sub g. And A sub g is the unknown. That's the one we're going to solve for. So it's just a matter of simplifying the equation at that point. We've still got that problem at the end where fish are going to be losing calories when they starve, but they're going to actually, what we measure is they're going to be their loss of weight. So I want you to go ahead and make that next step and tell me how much weight they're going to be losing, not just how many calories. Okay, we're going to quit at that point, and coverage on the exam that we're going to have on Thursday will extend up through here, not into anything beyond this. You know, I don't want to make you complacent or keep you from studying, but I want to tell you that my exams are designed to try to give you a fair evaluation of your mastery of the material. They're not designed to trick you or punish you or do anything else like that. So just be honest with yourself about the material, and you'll be okay. Anybody who has a concern or a question, though, be sure and contact me, either in person or by email or by phone. Thanks, folks.